Today, as we continue our study in the book of Numbers, we're going to do just that. We're going to read the book of Numbers. So if you have a Bible, you can go ahead and turn there. We're going to be in chapter 16 today. If you want to use one of the Bibles in the seat back in front of you, it's going to be, I think, a page 116. And then we're going to flip over to chapter 20, which will be on page 119. And we're going to continue studying along. And if you've been with us, I highly encourage you to read with us through the book of Numbers. We're reading roughly a chapter a day together as a church. There's a reading plan that's probably on the seat back in front of you. Or I know there's some stacks on the way out. You can grab one of those and take them with you. And we're reading roughly a chapter a day. And I want to encourage you to follow along with us, because this book, the book that most people stop reading their Bible when they try to read it straight through, they normally stop here, is actually a really fascinating book that is very helpful for us to understand more about God and honestly who He's even called us to be, who live in this day and age. And so if you haven't been reading along, or maybe you stopped reading along, just jump back in with us right where we're at. I want to encourage you, if you call this church home and you're going to be attending with us, just read along with us. It's roughly a chapter a day. We're talking about 8, maybe 10 minutes a day, and you'll be all caught up. But to catch us up as you're turning in your Bibles, here's where we are. We haven't been together for 2 weeks in person, so let me tell you where we are in the story. We're reading about a people called the Israelites who God has rescued them, has delivered them out of bondage and slavery. They've left Egypt, in the place in which they were enslaved, and God miraculously has been leading them. He led them to a place called Mount Sinai, and at the bottom of this mountain, they camped out there for a year. And as they were camped there, God kind of reinstantiated some of the relationship that they kind of lost through their tradition and through the years of slavery. He reminded them of the promise that He had given Abraham, the kind of the patriarch of this people, the promise that was bound up in what's called a covenant, the promise that God was going to, first of all, make this family a people, and that this people would have a place to call home, and in that place, this people would live as a testament to the goodness of God to a world that needed to experience Him. And all of this was reminded to them at the bottom of this mountain. And we start this book of Numbers in which we take a census of how many people are there. And we're told there's roughly 600,000 men of fighting age. So roughly we think about 2 million people were on this trek together. And God tells them how to organize their camp and how they're supposed to live by tribe or by family descendants. And that even the way that they set their camp up is supposed to be all centered around God's presence, which dwells in the middle of this camp of 2 million people. It's a very, very large camp. And then God leads them through the wilderness. He leads them miraculously through the wilderness. His Spirit is seen in this cloud of smoke by day and this pillar of fire by night. God miraculously moves, and when His presence moves, the people unfurl and their whole camp packs up and they follow Him along. And then when He stops, they stop and they reset up camp around Him, and keeping God at the center. And so, why is all of this important as we study this in this day and age, you may be asking? Well, for those of you who are Christians in the room, just to remind you that we are people who have experienced God's presence and a lot of His grace. We are people who have experienced some promises and the covenants that God has made with us. And in Christian or not, all of us intrinsically, when we live in this world, we see things and we think, is this all there is? Or maybe some other thoughts from time to time, this can't be the way it should be. Other things that kind of go through our minds. And that would be in direct line with what the scriptures tell us about our experience and our reality and who God is. You see, the New Testament calls this life we live a little bit, or it describes it like a wilderness. In the same way we see these Israelites walking through a wilderness, trying to get to the land that God has promised them. And that this walk of life through the wilderness of our lives, that it is preparation for us to receive the promises of God. And our lives, the lives that you live, the life that I lived, when we live our lives, it is so much more than just hanging on until we get to see God face to face, or hanging on until we get to heaven. There's so much more meaning and purpose in our experience. And so I think this book shows us that repeatedly. And we're going to look at some of those purposes, or some of those challenges rather, and how we're to respond as we maintain that purpose today as we study. Now, Since I missed you for so long, that was a longer introduction for being gone and away for a couple weeks due to the snow. But before I get any more ahead of myself, I do want to read the scriptures together. So if you're able with me, I want to invite you to stand. We're going to read again in Numbers chapter 16. We'll move around just a little bit because I don't want to read all of it. But we're going to read the scriptures, we're going to pray, and then we're going to get to work in our study. Number 16, starting in verse 1. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, and Dathan, and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Poleth, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation chosen from the assembly, well-known men. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" When Moses heard it, he fell on his face, and he said to Korah and all his company, "In the morning, the Lord will show who is his, and who is holy, and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him. Do this, take censers, Korah and all his company, put fire in them, and put incense on them, and before the Lord tomorrow, and the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the Holy One. You've gone too far, sons of Levi." And Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi. Is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them, and that he has brought you near him, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you? And would you seek the priesthood also? Therefore, it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is Aaron that you grumble against him?" And then Moses gives instructions from here to fast forward a little bit. He gives instructions here and tells them how they're going to discern the will of the Lord, and tells everyone to kind of separate themselves, and in Korah to go to his tent, and these other men, and let's call them rabble-rousers, to go to their tents with their families as well. But skipping down to verse 28 to kind of move along in the story, after they've all gone to their tents. And Moses said, "Hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord." And as soon as he finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the people who belonged to Korah and all their goods. And skipping over to chapter 20, I'm going to start in verse 2. This is some time later. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. This is the word of the Lord. God, help us as we study. Amen. You may be seated. Thank you for standing for the reading of God's word. Big idea for the day, the thing that I'm hoping that we'll take out of this reading this passage is that in the wilderness, we've got to remember God's holiness. In the wilderness, remember God's holiness. So the question begs, what is holiness? Holiness, or to be holy, literally means just to be set apart. God is set apart. He is totally other than our experience. His holiness is uncompromising. He is perfect in all his ways. His holiness actually demands of us our reverence and our obedience, as we have seen throughout these scriptures, and as Jesus affirms later. The book of Numbers goes to great lengths actually to remind us of God's holiness repeatedly. It's something that it's a topic that we've come and we've circled around again and again and again. And today we look at it from a slightly different aspect, or from a different facet, if you will. We saw this when the camp was organized. I mentioned this in the opening, that God tells his people to organize themselves physically around himself and his presence. We see this in the laws regarding purity and repentance, and how that people are to turn from all the ways that they have followed that are not of God, and how even when they have wronged each other, that they are to bring restitution. This is the kind of holiness that we are to see growing in this camp, if you will, as they travel. As they follow God's presence, they are not to be the kind of people who make their own plans and ask God to bless their plans, but rather the kind of people who prepare themselves to do the will of God as he leads them. They are to be a different kind of people who trust in God's provision, even in the midst of their own unmet preferences or desires, that they will trust wholeheartedly that God will provide for them. And God has shown up time and time again, even when they have rebelled time and time again, and they've trusted their own preferences or desires. We see in the book of Numbers that living as a holy people who pursue holiness, when we live that way, or when these people live that way, what increased was, yes, reverence, but also order in their midst. And when they didn't, and when they embraced irreverence of God and chose to live their own way, chaos is what reigned amongst them. We'll continue to see that as the story unfolds. But I just want to underscore, as we jump in here, as we talking about remembering God's holiness, as we traverse a wilderness, we've got to remember that the picture that has already been painted in this book is about God's presence, his order and authority shaping every area of our lives as humans. And that reverence for God's holiness and embracing God's holiness as a people is what sets us onto the trajectory of the destiny that God has for us. We see this played out in these scriptures. And so we see today how some of the very practical ways, or the practical challenges that it is for us as people to remain holy as we traverse the wilderness of life. So in the wilderness, we must remember God's holiness. Specifically, we have an interesting story that opens up, which I think points to this fact that in the wilderness, we have to remember God's holiness, especially when we are filled with envy. Korah is this story of Korah is this crazy story. I can't imagine that ends up with this earthquake and the ground splitting open and swallowing people alive. It's this crazy, miraculous, God intervening story. And it begins, though, with a group of people who are envious of other people's position. Have you ever been envious of someone else's position? Maybe even in your own family. Firstborns, any firstborns in the room? Yeah, that's probably not you. Any secondborns? Yeah, okay. So I feel you. I got you. Even in our own families, we see this from time to time. Many of you know I have several kids, a lot of kids. Most of them are actually on their way back right now from a youth camp up in New Hampshire, where they went swimming in a frozen lake for some reason. I don't know why, but they did. But they're coming back. And you see this in your own family. You see kids, maybe you remember this from your own life, of being envious, typically, of the older ones and what they experience, the authority that they get to walk around in the home. I remember when we got to the glorious age of not having to hire babysitters anymore. It was so amazing. Young parents, there's hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel. You won't always have to hire that out. One day, your oldest kid will be able to watch your younger kids, I promise. But there will be strife. Because one day the younger one will look up and say, hang on a second, why can't I be in charge? And the answer is because you can't even reach up to turn the stove off yet. You're too short. Like there's lots of reasons for that. You can't even unlock or lock the doors yet. And so like the older kid will be necessarily in charge. And you'll be dealing with this, what we're looking at on a much more practical scale in your own life. But when it comes to the scriptures, and we see this example or this story of Korah and in the followers that he has, they're envious of Moses and Aaron's position. They're envious. And all jokes about family and birth order aside, we feel this from time to time. I feel this from time to time. Maybe it's not in your family. Maybe it's in your job. Maybe it's in your school. Maybe it's with that neighbor and the thing that they get. Maybe it's organizationally. Maybe you're leading a company and you see the favor that your competitor has with city officials or government officials to get the things that they want so that they might get a leg up on the competition. And you see that. We see what others see and we hear what they think and we see what others are promoting. And at times we think, you know what? I can do that. They're just like me. Why can't I be in a position of influence? Why can't I receive the blessing? Why can't people respect me? I live just as good of a life. So Korah and his friends, they show up to Moses and Aaron and they say, you know what? We're holy too. We're holy just like you. We're part of God's people. We know who God is. We follow the same cloud of smoke and the same pillar of fire at night. We are a part of this thing. We're holy just like you. Who do you think you are to wield the authority that you do over us? We don't like how you're doing it. Is what these leaders come. And they've become envious of Moses and Aaron's leadership. But Korah has it twisted in his mind. You see, they think that their personal holiness entitles them to a position where God has not appointed them or designated them to be. They think that just because they know who God is, that they should somehow receive the same exact story all the way down to the way that their lives are organized, the people that they get to boss around as Moses and Aaron, who God has appointed in that place over that people at that time. You hear it. All of us are holy. Is their argument. But I need to remind you, Moses was not inherently qualified because of his holiness or because of the stuff that he did right. The reason why Moses was qualified and Aaron were qualified, the reason why these two men at this time were qualified to lead these people was because God had called them, had set them apart and equipped them. This was the work of God to do. God's sovereign hand was still at work in his people, even in the way that he set up leadership. The truth is the same in our own lives. Be very, very careful when you want to undo the structures that God has placed in your life. Whether it's in your home, you want to kind of undermine the authority, if you will, of your parents. For those of you who are still at home with your parents, undermine the authority of your spouse with your kids at time. Be very careful of how you do this in the workplace as well, or on your campus. We live in a day and an age where it seems like a virtue to undermine authority left and right because we are just like them. How dare they try to lead us or have an opinion different than ours? Be very, very, very careful when these times come. Particularly within the people of God, we see this played out in this moment. Korah's rebellion is actually referenced in the New Testament. It's talked about in a very short book called the Book of Jude, the next to the last book of the Bible. And it shows us here that this rebellion was not just a rejection of Moses and Aaron, but it's actually a rejection of God's sovereign ordering. And that his sin is being called out. Korah's sin is being called out and associated with the idea, with the concepts of pride or self-exaltation, and ultimately rejection of God, because they are rejecting God's authority. And these traits are all dangerous in any kind of leadership. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but all of you, every single one of you, if you are breathing in this room, God has called you to lead something. We have to be careful when we feel those things of envy. God does not like it. And I want to say to those of you in this room who maybe have had or will have, or maybe presently have an area in your life or something in which you look around you and you say, these things are not right. Maybe it's in your job, like I said, maybe it's something in your family, maybe it's even something in your neighborhood or your school. Be careful when people start to buddy up to you and start to whisper things in your ear like, you know what, you're right. You could have their position. You're right. You could do it better. Be very careful. Slow down. Slow down. Because all that will do will stoke the envy of your heart. I'm not saying that the person ahead of you or the person that vexes you is absolutely right. But what I am saying is if you try to move outside of the sovereign will of the Lord, it will not go well for you. Slow down and ask God and trust that he will lead you and guide you in those moments. Because what the last thing that we want to do is to despise the Lord. That's what the scriptures say. Korah despised the Lord in this moment. And the judgment comes swift and powerfully here. The judgment is something, one of the most amazing in the technical sense, terrifying that we have seen in Scripture. The judgment is that these people, and their entire families were, quote, they went down to Sheol alive. Moses said, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to kill you. This isn't about rebellion. Ultimately, the judgment you're going to get, this isn't treason. This isn't like you just committed treason against the nation. In fact, what we're going to do to prove who God actually has set up to lead his people is we're just going to ask him to judge. And if you die like everybody else dies, I'm going to tell you, in other words, if you die of old age or of natural circumstances, it's just going to prove that you are absolutely right. But if God does something amazing that we cannot explain, then it will prove something altogether differently. And this is what happens. It says the ground opens up and swallows them, their entire tents, their entire households. And this judgment was a different kind of judgment. It was a judgment that their entire bodies, not just their spirits, entered into that place of death. It was a divine judgment. It was swift, and it was powerful, and it was clearly God's judgment. Envy is not the only thing that marks us, though, as humans. Envy is not. In fact, envy has a almost like a gateway issue, I would say, in our own lives. And the people deal with this other issue shortly thereafter, and we read about this in the shorter passage in chapter 20, where we were reading about them going to Meribah and experiencing the miracle of God's water coming out of this rock. But it starts with a people who are filled with discontentment. And in the wilderness, we must remember God's holiness, especially when we are filled with discontentment. I'm going to read these few short verses together one more time. Verse 2-9 says this: Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, Would that he had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness? You hear what they're saying. Not why have God. They're following a miraculous cloud of smoke during the day and a pillar of fire at night. Not why is God leading us here? Moses, why have you led us here? So they're asking. That we should die here, both we and our cattle. And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or wines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces before God. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. God is responding to a people in a merciful way, I believe, but a people who are filled with discontentment. And I know we started with envy because it began there in the kind of the progression of the story, but what's most likely more often and what most of us are probably dealing with on a more regular basis is this idea of discontentment. But these two things go hand in hand, envy and discontentment. If we're not careful, discontentment will lead us to the place of envy that we don't want to be. But let's just talk about these place of discontentment. These things takes root in our hearts so fast. Talked about it, I think, last week, but even on my way to church last Sunday, I was literally thinking, God, why can't this be easier? Why do we have to do church here? Why does it have to snow on Saturday? Like literally any other day, but Saturday night into Sunday, like this is the worst. And like, really though, is it really that bad? Like, is it really? We have indoor plumbing. The heater still works. Like the sidewalks are clean. Is it that big of a deal? No, but I'm so quick to become discontent. We see this in our everyday lives. Like, well, I can't believe that. Okay, we believe that, we're in this nation or with these leaders or those leaders, or I can't believe that my neighbors think this way, or my kids won't pick up their clothes. Well, God, why did you have to give me this house? It's so terrible. It's always falling apart. We always think these like, God, what is going on? And we begin to blame one another. See, actually, the reason that I'm this way is because you're holding me back. And then it turns to envy really quickly because I want what you have. And all these times we're discontent about where God has left us. And you can read your own story or your own examples into that all day long. But the Israelites here, they grumble. It says they grumble against God. They're discontent. And it moves simply beyond, we need water. And they've forgotten, again, that they're following the miraculous manifestation of the presence of God through a wilderness. And in this wilderness, in which he is continuing to preserve them, even though they have rejected his promise already, to the point that God has said, only your kids are going to inherit this promise. But I will provide for you. I'm going to show you this great mercy and give that promise to your kids since you rejected it. They come here and they say again, they look at Moses and say, what are you doing? You're leading us to our deaths. This is horrible. How can we possibly? We should have never have left our slavery and our bondage. These are people who remember it. They were there. They remember God showing up about a dozen times before and miraculously through the scriptures at this point. And all of a sudden, again, they find themselves discontent and unable to simply seek God and ask for him to move. They're forgetting who their God is. They are forgetting how set apart he is and how he has set them apart to be people who trust in him. They're forgetting how he has provided. And instead of trusting in his ability to provide, instead of trusting in God's character, and instead of trusting in God's holiness, they complain, which reveals their lack of faith and their trust in the character of God himself. Man, I don't know. Again, I don't know. I gave you the snow example, but I can remember so clearly when I distance myself from times in my life, and perhaps you're like me, I can remember so clearly moments where I was just so discontent. I'm so thankful God just provided for me the grace and the mercy of seeing that discontentment. I can remember early on in my marriage, my wife and I mean, poor, like couldn't pay the rent, subsisted off of peanut butter and jelly. That is not a joke. Like we had nothing when we first got married. And I can remember in those early days just being like, you know what, God, like tithe, you want me to give to you? I can't even, like, I don't even have food to eat. I'm skipping meals some. Like, what are you talking about? And being so discontent in my soul. And yet, God, by his grace, usually through the mouth of my wife speaking to me, reminding me of who God is and the promises that he has to provide for those that he loves. that he is not going to allow us to die. He's not going to allow us to perish, but he's actually providing for us something in this wilderness that we're walking through that is going to form us into people that he's called us to be. I'm so thankful that God said that and reminded me of that through his scriptures, but also often through the mouth of my wife, reminding me of those things, like sometimes very forcefully when I got very discontent. So thankful of that. So thankful that when I was discontent about the proximity that my wife and I have to our family and how far we live away from them, which is roughly 1,500 miles now. We are from people from big families, and our families are not perfect, but mostly functional, and we mostly like hanging out with most of them. And so, I hope they're not watching this on TV or something later. But we wanted our kids to know their grandparents, and yet God led us on a different journey. Now my kids know their grandparents, but they don't see them and know them as intimately as I wanted them to. God called us 15 years ago to move a very, very, very long way away. And one of the reasons I didn't want to do it, actually the number one reason I didn't want to do it, is because I didn't want to leave my family and my wife's family, large families again, mostly functional. And it was actually during a night of praying and trusting God with our future that I just came to the realization that the worst thing for my family is for me to disobey God. The worst thing for me, for my family that I love, that I claim to love, is for me to not follow the presence of the Lord. Because the way that we live our lives doesn't just affect us. If I allow the discontentment to rule my decision-making process, it will harm my extended family, whom I love. But if I trust God, then I got to trust that he is working out not only for the good of my life, but the good of my extended family as well. And that continues to be hard as parents age. It continues to be hard as they're navigating hospital stays and doctor's visits. It is not easy. But we have to trust the miraculous move of God's presence in the direction that he has for our lives. We must remember God's holiness when we're filled with discontentment in the wilderness. We can't let it progress to envy. But it goes beyond that. You know, sometimes we look at our leaders. I know that I look at my leaders, and sometimes I think, man, they've got it all together. The older I get, the more I realize that not all of them do. But when it comes in the church, and even here in the scriptures, Moses is this hero of the faith who's done amazing things. And even he here in this passage that we read today, he allows some things he allows unholiness to overcome his heart as well. And it changes the trajectory of his life. In the wilderness, we've got to remember God's holiness when we're filled with resentment. This passage at Meribah, when these people or the people of Israel are grumbling and complaining, are going beyond simply just recognizing the need that they have and turning it and allowing discontentment to overflow in this place of accusation against the leader of God for them. They yell at Moses and why are you doing this? Why have you brought us here? And then Moses and Aaron go and they fall before their face before God and say, God, what do we do? God gives them, he says, go and take this staff, which we think is Aaron's budded staff. We didn't read that. It's a very fascinating passage. If you back up 2 chapters, that's a freebie. That take this miracle staff and go out and hold this staff as an example or a symbol of the God's presence being with you, and speak to the rock so that water might flow out of it. But Moses does something different. It says, Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Moses, hear now, you rebels. Hear what he says. He doesn't say, he says, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Moses doesn't say, do you really need God to do this to prove himself again? He says, really? You want me to do this for you? Here you go. And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff. He didn't stand as in God's authority and presence and remind the people of who they are and who God is and said, now God will provide for you because he has promised it. He says, I'm going to do this for you. And water flows out abundantly. And the congregation drank. But God says to Moses, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. We later learned that Aaron also doesn't make it to the land because of this moment right here, this miraculous moment when God still provides mercifully, because what they do there is something that we are all tempted to do, I think. When we are filled with resentment, and I feel deeply for Moses in this situation, but when we have resentment, when we get to the end of our rope, we are so tempted to exalt ourselves. Again, go back to the parent analogy. Do it all the time with our kids. Like, wait, what did you say to me? Like, Moses exalts himself. Do you know who I am? What I've done for you? Ingrates. I put the ingrates in there. It's not in the Bible, but like Moses exalts himself, and he takes that staff and he strikes the rock, and in so doing, excludes himself from the promise of God. He defiles himself in a way. And it's tempting for all leaders. It's tempting for anyone who has any kind of influence anywhere to elevate ourselves, making it seem like our idea to the solution is the solution to the problem. When something miraculous happens, it makes it seem like it's our faithfulness or our correctness, and that it came from us, especially when it's in response to these major challenges. But do you see here that Moses, his rebellion is very similar to Korah's in some ways? Yeah, it's in response to resentment. He's so resentful of these people, not envy of these people. But Korah says, hey, we're holy just like you. Why are you high and lofty? And he elevates himself in that way. He tries to bring Moses down so that he might be on an even playing field. Moses comes and elevates himself similarly. He elevates himself to a higher status. Shall we bring this water out for you? Both of these responses, Korah and Moses, they're rooted in pride. And they show us the danger of self-exaltation. We've got to be careful here. And I keep kind of passively alluding to this concept of leadership. And so some of you might be tempted to kind of just check out and say, well, I'm not the president. Praise God. I'm not in this cabinet. I'm not a selectman or a select person on one of these towns. I don't even lead at my company. I just show up to my job. I do my thing. I come home. I take care of my house. But leadership at its basic level is simply influence. And all of us, we have influence. When we look at these passages, we're not supposed to read, I'm not Moses. I'm not Korah. Because God has called all of us to lead something in the wilderness. He has. He's given us each influence in our families, our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our schools. And so the question comes for all of us, how will we respond when we are filled with resentment, especially towards those that we're influencing or we're leading? Will we respond in a holy manner? Will we respond in righteousness, in faith in God, the holy creator of it all, who is guiding us through this wilderness of life by his miraculous power? Or will we elevate ourselves and just like Moses and Korah and all the people, and through our discontentment, rebel against God's purposes? All three of these groups here we see trusted in themselves over God. So that leads us to the last idea, and I promise we're going to land this plane real soon. In the wilderness, remember God's holiness so that you may inherit the promise. God's working to fulfill his promise. He's not working on your timeline. He's not working on my timeline. He's not doing it the way that I want him to do it a lot of times, and he's not doing it the way that you want him to do it a lot of times. He is working to fulfill his promise. Yet we see here repeatedly the people that we're introduced to fail to recognize it at some point or another. And their holiness is a big piece of why. Let me back up just a little bit. God's promise for you is for you to experience his life and his blessing and his grace to its fullest degree. That is his promise for you. God is doing something in your life. so that at the end of all things, when heaven and earth come crashing back together, you might experience his grace and his presence more fully and more tangibly than you ever could have dreamed. And it will be the best thing that you could have experienced. And where we find ourselves now, while we look forward to that promise, where we find ourselves is in this process of walking through the wilderness together. And the only way we're going to make it is if we anchor our belief in that promise and trust we anchor that belief and that trust to God's character, not in our ability to traverse the wilderness, not in our ability to make it to the end and being a good person. We've got to trust God and his character. And in so doing, we can continue to trust him to do something not only in all of our lives, but in our homes, and in our workplaces, in all of our spheres of influence in relationship, that we can trust that God is going to do something in our family, and in our bodies, in our in our emotions, and in our relations with our neighbors, and in the way that we're structured in our jobs, and like all these things, we can walk through these moments of wilderness and pain and questioning and resentment at times, or discontentment, and we can trust God here because we're not trusting that he just likes us a whole bunch, which he does. We're trusting that he is who he says he is, that he's a God of all power and sovereign. His sovereign will and work will be accomplished, and the good that he has will overflow into our lives, ultimately at the end of it all, when heaven and earth come crashing back together. But in the meantime as well, in ever-increasing measure, as we walk the path that he has for us towards the reception of that promise perfectly one day. And that this is a promise for all of us. This is a promise that is for a people. It's not an I promise, but it's an us promise. This is something we realize together. And so our hope is in him, in God, who is preparing himself a people through a wilderness. And so we should not be surprised that it is this way. This is the way that it is. You know, the New Testament starts with the wilderness setting. We're Christians, so we're going to talk about Jesus as we end. The New Testament starts with a wilderness setting. Matthew chapter 4, Luke chapter 4, you can go read it on your own time. But Jesus is in a wilderness as well. And how many times do you remember him being tempted? Anybody know? Stop, top of your head. Sunday school answer? 3 times? Good job. Good job, 3 times. Did you notice how he was tempted? He was tempted with, you can again read this on your own time. But he's fasting. He's 40 days in the wilderness, just like the Israelites are 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. He's tempted with power. God's sworn enemy, the devil incarnate, Satan himself, shows up to Jesus in his moment of weakness and tempts him with power and envy. This could all be yours. I could give it to you. He tempts him with food. He's hungry. He tempts him with his discontentment. He tempts him with his insecurity or his resentment. He's like, if you are the Son of God, why don't you just prove it? Just throw yourself down. God will take care of you. Aren't you resenting the way that God has you walking through this life? He tempts him in all these ways. But Jesus does something different than Moses. He does something different than Korah and the people of Israel. He demonstrates unwavering faith and obedience to the Father's plan. He trusts in God's holiness. And in so doing, embraces it for himself. And this is how Jesus makes it through the wilderness. And so for those of you who are Christians today, we must do the same. I want to encourage you to examine your heart for envy, for discontentment, and for resentment. Are you trusting in this life? Are you trusting God's sovereign plan? Are you elevating yourself? Family, we got to pursue holiness as a community as well. This is never an I endeavor. It's never just about me or just about you. It's about us together. Yes, that means show up to church regularly, absolutely. But it means so much more than that. So much more than that for us to pursue Jesus together. For those of you who are not Christians and you're visiting with us today, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for being with us. So I want to recognize that holiness is not about earning God's love, but rather responding to it. Responding to God's love is the way that we embrace holiness. And Jesus does this perfectly. He's succeeded where all of us have failed. He walked through the wilderness of this life and showed us a different way. He passed the test, if you will, that we all face every day. And he invites us to his holiness through faith. And if there's any of you wondering more about that, we'd love to pray or talk with you or discuss that with you after our service today.